first things first, get out your onesie or whatever that you're going to be putting these ribbon strips onto, and we're going to measure to know how much we're going to need. So just taking my ruler, I'm measuring, we're going to need about 10 inches. And so knowing that, then we can know how many strips of ribbon we need to cut. Before I cut my ribbon, I just get the ribbons and line them up and just make sure that I am going to have enough. And so here, once it's all together, there's kind of some overlap and some spaces in between, but once it's cut and put together, then I will have about a little over 10 inches, and that's perfect for what I want. So now that I've got what I want, I'm going to take a picture of it so I remember what order I had it in, and then I'll show you how to cut the strips. The length that we're going to cut the ribbon, it depends on the size of the shirt or the onesie that you're going to be making or that you're going to be using. So you're going to want to take a look at that and see what you think looks good. So for mine's an 18-month onesie. I'm going to cut my ribbon to 5-inch strips. And I'm going to cut 2 of each ribbon. After you've cut your ribbon, then take your lighter and seal your ends. So cut out as many strips, 2 strips per ribbon for all of your ribbons, and then we'll sew them together. Taking your ribbon strips that we just cut, fold it in half, and then we're just going to sew them together. And I'm doing this using like a 1/4 inch seam. And then just go a little bit, and then we're gonna get the next one. And then so on, just taking the next one. So you just sew until you get to the edge, and then fold your next ribbon in half and place it in there, and then start sewing and it will pull it. And so what this does is it sews all the ribbons at the same time, and it also makes it so you don't waste any thread by having to sew it, cut it, do another one. You can also sew it right onto the onesie, but this just makes sure that all the loops are made and are even, so when we go to put it on the onesie, it will be a little bit easier. Once your loops are cut and sewed, we're going to pin them to our onesie. And so you're gonna need pins, and I have mine in the order that I want to put them on. We're gonna put the bottom row on first, and so taking a pin, and you can use 1 or 2 pins per ribbon if you'd like, especially for the bigger 1.5 inch ones. And we're gonna pin it across right above the leg line. If you kind of are unsure about having a straight line, you can always just use like a disappearing ink fabric marker and then just draw, like using a ruler. You can just draw a line nice and straight to help you know where to pin it. We're gonna pin it about 1/2 inch, the top of this about 1/2 inch above the leg line. And then make sure that you are pinning it only to one layer of the onesie or shirt. So here's my first row all finished. And so now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're just gonna sew along the edge. So get out your sewing machine, and we're gonna do a zigzag stitch. along the edge of these ribbons. And so holding it open, so we just are sewing on one side of the onesie. We're gonna stitch along that same stitch that we did when we were sewing the loops together. That can help with placement of where you're gonna be stitching. And be sure to back stitch when you start. And as you're stitching, just make sure that the loops are close together. The fabric's gonna wanna pull apart. So as you're pushing it through, just make sure that they're together and right next to one another. Okay, then what you're going to do now is remove the pins, and then we'll start pinning the second row. So here's how it looks once we have it sewed on, and then we're just going to start on our second row. So we want about 1/2 inch of that to be showing, and so maybe a little bit more, about 1 inch. Just depends on what the desired look that you want to get out of is. So one thing to keep in mind is that we're going to be putting some rickrack along the top right here, and so that much of your loop is going to be showing. So how much of the loop on the bottom do you want to be showing? So just keep that in mind as you're pinning your second row. So again, just like the bottom row we did, we're just going to start pinning it on. And as you can see over here, I have what I'm going to be putting on. So I'm just going to put that along the second row, and we'll sew the second row. So here's my second row all ready to be sewn. So I'm going to do the same thing and sew that zigzag stitch across. Now that the sewing of the loops is done, we're going to sew on the rickrack along the top of the ribbons. And before I do that, I'm going to be sewing on a little loop to hold the bow. You can just pin the bow on, and that will work just fine. I put a clip on my bow, so I could also use it as a hair accessory if I wanted to when I'm not using this. So I folded this in half, and then that's where I'm going to know where to sew on my loop. And then just taking a needle and thread, just going to quickly sew on this loop by just stitching along the edge of the ribbon. So then I'm just going to bring this around, and it doesn't have to be super tight, but it doesn't have to be really, really loose either. So you can see right there. And I'm just going to sew this part on. And we don't want to sew straight through like we were doing, because then we can't pull the ribbon through or pull the clip through. So I'm just going to take the edge and just sew it on. Okay, and then I'm just going to take a couple stitches in the back. Okay, now it's ready to be sewn. So here is the onesie with the rickrack pinned onto it, and then I put that in the center first, and then I pinned the outside rickrack and then this side rickrack. Now when you're pinning it, we want to make sure that we get the top of the ribbon. And so you can kind of still see the zigzag edge that we sewed on. And so I'm going to be going back through and putting another strip of rickrack down. It looks really cute. If you're sure that you just want one line of rickrack, then what you can do is when you're sewing your loops together, just make sure that you're sewing as close to the edge as possible. And then when you're sewing it onto the onesie, that you're sewing as close to the edge as possible. And then when you put your rickrack on, it shouldn't show any. All right, so sewing rickrack, some people will just sew down the middle. I like to not use a zigzag stitch, but sew a zigzag. And that just seems to hold it a little bit better so it doesn't, so the edges of the rickrack won't fold over. So I'm just gonna start sewing and be sure to back stitch. And then I just turn it. So it does take a little bit more time, but I like the results. If you want to just do it the other way and just go straight across, then that works to do that as well. So I'm just going to finish up sewing this rickrack down, and then I'll show you kind of what it looks like with that second rickrack and sewing that on. So here I've just finished doing the one row of rickrack, and I just wanted to show you this before I did the second row so you can see what that looks like. And then if you just want to leave it like this, then you're done, and you can either pin on your bow or place your clip on, put your clip on the inside of it, and that finishes this super cute onesie. So here I've just pinned my second row of rickrack, if you can see that there. And then I didn't get a chance to show on my first row, but when you get to the end, you can just cut your rickrack like that, and then take your lighter, and just like ribbon, when you seal the ends, you can do that same thing with the rickrack, and that way it won't fray. So I'll go ahead and get this sewn, and then you can see what it looks like. And then we're all finished.